Okay, so what we have here is the philosophy page of on Destiny's website. For anyone who doesn't know, tuning in, Destiny is a longtime figure in the online Twitch streaming debate politics space, I guess you could call it. It's an amorphous thing. It changes all the time. It mutates. Controversial figure. So nothing here is an endorsement. But interesting because he's one of the few guys who's kind of given some attention to philosophy and philosophical ideas as they pertain to political discourse or discourse about, the issues of the day. Particularly at a time where, for a lot of people, the entry of philosophy into those sorts of discussions is just like annoying guys talking about logical fallacies or esoteric nonsense, right? Which it also is, for sure. There's a lot of that, but kind of seeing the importance of philosophy to a lot of contemporary issues, I think is it is important. It is something I appreciate and agree with, and so I guess at some point Destiny felt like he had to explain a bunch of things, and so he put a bunch of stuff here on his website. I also am under the impression that there is a lot of extra stuff. There's like an extended lore, like maybe he's talked about stuff in videos, right? And he's talked about stuff with I know some other philosophy students on his streams before. Also published something recently, a manifesto. So I mean, I understand there's probably maybe some extensions of what's here, some developments, maybe he's changed his view, but we're just going to take this as is, right? Just original primary text, early Wittgenstein, no revisions. I'm going to see what's going. And I know I've titled this as well as a review, but I don't think the point here is to be critical. Just to, I don't know, see what's here, meander our way through. It's kind of quiet on the Twitch side. I know I don't normally stream at this time. I usually stream on weekday mornings. Okay, let's have a look. I'll start reading. Wait, should I get some music? What's appropriate music? Have this. Okay, hopefully that's not too intrusive. Just background enough. Let's get stuck in. Where'd my chat windows go? Philosophy. Why philosophy is important. In doing online debate about politics, it is extremely important to have a philosophical foundation from which to draw political conclusions. Politics is downstream from philosophy, and you could argue that it is simply the practice of applied philosophy on a societal level. Okay. While I have no formal education in philosophy, through the use of resources such as the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and Wikipedia articles, I've taken pains to construct some sort of philosophical heuristic to solve policy issues. I'd be really interested to hear how you solve policy issues with philosophy. I mean, if you've come up with like a simple heuristic to do so, that would be really useful to, I don't know, look at. Kind of like, oh, here is policy question. Here is heuristic moving from philosophical position to potential solution to the issue. So I'd be interested to see that. Also, note on these sources, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Now, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is very good because it's usually written by people, like single author on each article, by someone who's like very knowledgeable about that particular part of philosophy. A problem is that it is written by one person, so you tend to get like one perspective. Obviously, they're directed to do something very general and broad, like an overview, and to have a lot of recommended reading in there, which is good. I've also noticed, because I've read quite a lot of Stanford Encyclopedia lately, a lot of it is just terribly edited, right? You just find lots of grammar issues and typos, which in itself isn't worrying, but it's kind of it's the brown M&Ms in the punch bowl, right? It kind of tells you that there's like a general issue of not being reviewed. So what I imagine is, someone gets an assignment to write a Stanford Encyclopedia entry. They're kind of stoked about it, and they write this long thing, and they submit it, and it gets published. And no one's really looking at them too carefully. So I think a lot of them also suffer from readability issues. They can be very dense. They assume that you know too much. There's some where I've read them, and they're trying to be general and like an overview. It's like so and so says this, but the problem with that, but you already need to be in that context to understand what's happening, right? It's like someone recounting to you an argument between friends, but you already need to know like a lot of the background drama and story to understand what's being said. And if you just don't have that, if it's like your first exposure to that field or that subfield, it can be incomprehensible. Definitely had that lately. I was reading specifically the one, was it? Stanford Encyclopedia entry on equality, I think. Yeah. Anyway, moving on. And Wikipedia, yeah, Wikipedia can be okay. The Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, if I'm remembering it correctly, is pretty good because it's kind of a little bit less technical, a little bit more popular than Stanford, a little bit more for general audience. Plus, they also have a lot of topics that you won't find on the Stanford Encyclopedia, like some really interesting ones. Anyway, moving on. This has allowed me to more effectively understand my own and others' arguments through the underlying philosophical values and processes at play, as well as create a consistent set of rules to abide by when evaluating various political issues. Yeah, so this talk about being downstream and underlying, so it seems like there's this assumption of a kind of foundationalism, right? That when you get down to what's justifying everything at the bottom, that's helpful, which is something I broadly agree with, but there are some pragmatic things which come into play, right? If you try and sit down and have a political discussion with someone and they start off by saying that they're skeptical about the existence of the external world, so they're not sure about the relevance of politics, right? I think you can be justified in saying like you're just not in the right place for having a discussion with that person. And so an appeal to foundations, it's like, well, in order to have political discussions, you have to have a foundation in that justifies your belief in an external world. No, right? And I know that's a silly example, but what I think it illustrates is that discussions have to start somewhere. So oftentimes when you're talking with someone, you have to have certain things that are agreed upon, that are your starting points or that are assumed. And often in a lot of discussions, that can go without saying. Especially in everyday discussions, there's a lot that is assumed in the background that you don't talk about, that is kind of grounding that whole discussion. When you get into talk about politics and then you start saying, okay, but what do you mean by a person? And what do you mean by being more or less well off than someone else, right? Yeah, you start excavating a little bit and you start finding what are the things that you thought were assumed but are actually points of disagreement. So this is where foundation, like a more foundational idea about discussions comes in handy, which is I think what he's gesturing at, is that a lot of times when you're talking about some issue with someone, you start digging down as to where you disagree and you start finding these deep things that you need to address. But the question is always like, how deep can you go? Like, Because sometimes you'll get into a discussion with someone and you'll get to something like they don't think that all people are worthy of basic human dignity or something like that. Right? Do you need to go deeper than that, or you just be like, okay, well, you're just not the sort of person who I can have discussions with, right? Because there's something so fundamental and so deep that we don't agree on. That although we might be able to litigate that issue, the cost in energy and time is just not worth it. Because what do you benefit from it? You spend all this time and resources and energy trying to convince this person that everyone, to convince someone of basic human dignity. You convince them, okay, what have you got, right? You could spend your time somewhere else because their idea will be so fringe, right? That you're not getting something back, because often you can justify arguing something with someone even if you don't think you're going to convince them, because there are third parties who are listening in who you think can be convinced or swayed or are in a gray zone. But if you're getting down to the earlier examples, someone who doesn't necessarily believe in an external world, you can say that's, for a lot of people, that's not relevant for this discussion. So it's not worth my time or effort to dig down on that issue. Anyway, that was a long roundabout way to say nothing. Next, my applied political positions always follow from my moral system. Always. I mean, I doubt that's true. Just because it's so hard for any of us to do that, generally. Nothing specifically about destiny. I think the world would be a better place if people reflected more on their internal fundamental values and used those as guiding principles to establish their political values. Yeah, I don't know. That's... because there's some evidence that some people's fundamental values are... I don't know. What is an internal fundamental value? It's like your really basic moral intuitions. Maybe for some people, their internal fundamental values are kind of screwed up, and it wouldn't actually be better for them to spin those into principles and universalize them, right? So what's the argument in the background here, right? Let me continue the sentence. Rather than blindly following an ideologue or using inherited positions from their parents' religion, country, or party. Well, I mean, where do you think internal fundamental values come from? You can get your values from places. When they said blindly is applying to everything, right? So it's, yeah, sure, follow an ideologue or your parents' religion, but don't do so blindly. At least, yeah, reflect on it. There's an argument in the background here. Something maybe about consistency. Why do you want people to be consistent with their internal values? You get out of that. Just want people to be consistent? You trust that people's internal fundamental values are essentially good? And so if people acted on those, you would get better action than if they acted on values that came from outside, even though that distinction is very porous, right? Because a lot of things which we think are just like our own internally generated values, whatever that is, actually come from the outside. We don't see that source. Anyway, I think I'm being pedantic. A lot of political debate boils down to either having some differing fundamental position or disagreement on some empirical claim. Instead of two people arguing at a surface level about an issue, it is sometimes more useful to dive down to try and figure out what the other person actually believes at a fundamental level. A great example of this is abortion. People often debate back and forth about the legality of abortion while ignoring that they fundamentally disagree on whether or not a fetus should carry the same or similar moral consideration as an infant child. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. Is that, and I think this is where a lot of the value of philosophy comes in, is not so much like providing solutions to these thorny questions, but rather kind of, and also it comes from understanding the history of philosophy and contemporary debates, is that you gain a familiarity with the landscape of disagreement at a very fundamental level. So it equips you, I think, to better recognize where disagreements originate from, what they consist in, potential avenues for solving them. Like, oh, in order for us to agree, we would first have to agree on this part. But the thing is, you shouldn't expect that to lead to resolution. I don't think. I think that it's value enough in philosophy just to map that terrain of like, what does our disagreement consist in? What does the shape of our disagreement look like at its most basic level? So I think then we would, I think in just we might still keep on disagreeing with each other, but it would help us in other ways. We could disagree with each other, but still live together. I think one of the things which people tend to get wrong the most in contentious issues like social issues or political issues is, why do people disagree with me? A lot of people have very hard time understanding why people disagree with their position. Like, why do you think so differently about how society should be organized or how people should be treated? And I think from the confusion about that question, people tend to come up with explanations that are actually very harmful socially. So the reason why you think differently from me is because you're a bad person. You're evil. You're cruel. You want to hurt people, right? That's the only explanation I can think of for why you would have a different moral perspective or political perspective. And I think people are very frequently just completely wrong in those assessments. People are terrible at that sort of thing. And so seeing, oh, it's not, you disagree with me not because you're a terrible, evil, cruel person, but rather because you have this very different fundamental, maybe metaphysical outlook, on the world, right? Your conception of personhood is different. Therefore, you think fetuses are persons, and that justifies you taking these steps to ban abortion or something like that, or justifies your moral outlook on abortion. If I understand where that comes from, I'll be less likely to see your opposition to reproductive rights as just stemming from evil and cruelty, and more like something stemming from care for other persons. I would just think that you're mistaken about the metaphysics. Next, my foundational beliefs. Yeah, so I was right. There's like this assumption of foundationalism, right? That you got to start from the bottom. I don't think that's always the case. I don't think you always have to start from the bottom, because discussions have to start somewhere for pragmatic reasons. But so I agree with the kind of foundationalism that doesn't start at the bottom and tries to work its way up. I agree with foundationalism that permits digging, right? So you start at a certain place and then you're prepared to dig down to try and find that point where you meet, and then you're like, okay, this is where either we meet or we have an unresolvable difference. But if you try and start down where you think the bottom is, I think a lot of philosophy, once you really get into it, shows you that there is no bottom, right? Kind of like, you want to sail the ocean, with other people. You can say, well, before we do that, we need to know where the bottom of the ocean is first, and then we're gonna work our way up or something. It's like, no, that doesn't You start at the surface, dig down until you find out where the useful agreement or disagreement is, and then that's fine. You don't need to start at the bottom. But anyway, he has a video where he breaks down how I construct my philosophical worldview, which I highly recommend watching for a fleshed out understanding of my position. Yeah, so you can watch that. I'm not going to watch it. However, if you don't have the time to watch now, here's a short and incredibly basic summary of my philosophical foundations. Part 1. I exist. So really starting at like the Cartesian bottom, right? Famously, Rene Descartes invented philosophy. He invented philosophy when he said, "Think, therefore I am," and he made it possible for all of us to exist. It was very nice of him. Yeah. I mean, yeah, sure. I mean, some people take issue, right? I think they take issue with the link between existence and the I, the self. But I mean, I'm perfectly. This is a thing only a philosopher can say and sound magnanimous when they're doing it. I'm willing to grant that you exist. I'm willing to acknowledge that. I have an experience. An experience. At least one experience. Okay. I want to maximize my experience. What does maximize mean? Okay, I'm sure he's going to clarify further on, but what could maximize mean? Maximize. I want a lot of experience. So that would mean like I just want a long life rather than a short life. Right? I just want duration of experience. That's like the most experience. Or maybe you also have to factor in like how dense your experience is. You know, like how if something like really exciting is happening, it feels like you're packing more experience into the same amount of time. So I want a really long and really exciting life, which could mean that I'm just like living for 100 years in a war zone, constantly fighting for my life in sheer terror the whole time. So that would be maximizing my experience. I'm getting a lot of experience, right? It's maxed out. We're maxing that experience. I doubt that that's what he means. So maybe it's something like I want to... something positive about your experience. I mean, the most straightforward one is like some sort of hedonism, right? Like I want my experience to be the most positive that it can be. And that can be, you can combine duration into that, right? So, you know, in bioethics, they talk about quality adjusted life years. So in calculating certain procedures or medications, right? And say, well, we could keep this person alive for 50 years, but they'd be in agony the entire time. Or we can spend those same resources to extend someone's life by 25 years, but it's going to be a really good 25 years. This idea is that you find some way to combine the quality of the life with the duration to get something out the other side that lets you quantify against or compare against other things. So something like that. I want to maximize my experience. So I imagine that this is going to form the basis for some sort of normative claims, right? When you start talking about... that's where I'm guessing that's going. Also interesting here. Now, it might sound like I'm being critical by saying that it's not clear what maximize means, but I'm not. You know, a lot of people, especially people with philosophical training, are inclined to say that you have to be very clear about what you mean all the time at the outset. I'm not necessarily convinced that that is the case, because I think that you get some value from leaving certain terms or concepts open to interpretation. They can remain informationally rich by being undetermined. for a while at least. Like maybe eventually down the line, you got to clarify. But to start with, I think it's okay with being general, right? Because it gives you space to shuffle forward. One interesting thing though is that if some normative claims are going to be spun out of this, or if this is like forming an account of what it means for human welfare, right? There's a lot to say about subjective accounts of human welfare. By subjective, it's like it's dependent on the experience of the individual. What is good for an individual depends on what is available to them or present to them within their own experience, right? Whether that be happiness or contentedness or whatever. I think there's a few criticisms or problems with subjective notions of well-being or welfare or utility. Perhaps the most famous is Robert Nozick's experience machine, right? The idea that if what is good for people is what is good in their experience, then you can get what is maximally good for people just by giving them like a happiness pill or putting them in the matrix and have them eat steak the whole time, right? And at least in Robert Nozick's time, a lot of people said, oh, right, yeah, and that's not desirable. We don't want that. We don't want to live in an illusory world where we're just happy all the time. That doesn't feel like it has the kind of value that we want. We want other sorts of things. So some replacements were, I think, objectivist ideas of welfare or well-being, where you want to, there's like an actual list of things you want to do. Is that objectivist? Or is that, no, I think I'm confusing it with the other one. There's one where it's like, no, there's a bunch of things that are just objectively valuable, and there's another one where it's like, no, you have certain things that you want to do as a person. And you being tricked into thinking that you did those things is not the same. So I could say what's valuable for me maybe is that I form lasting, meaningful friendships with people. And so maybe you assume a subjective interpretation of that. And so you put me in an experience machine, or the matrix, where I experience having meaningful, or what look like meaningful, friendships. But I would say from some objective standpoint, no, that's not what I wanted. I didn't want to have the experience of having meaningful friendships. I wanted to actually have meaningful friendships. So therefore, I don't think that that confers value in my life to just experience that. So these are supposed to be broadly issues with subjective notions of welfare or well-being. Strangely, though, I think if you tracked over time how many people are convinced by these sorts of objections, I think it's actually gone down. A lot of people now, or what I found with philosophy students these days, is they're like, yeah, experience machine, sign me up. Datalist in the chat, expand the capacity of the base experience? Yeah. Yeah, so I think there are, I've heard of capacity-based theories when it comes to why we value equality. And why we value things like equality is also very closely tied into what we think human well-being consists of. So I'm not exactly sure what you mean. Maybe I can guess something. And the capacity of the base experience. Yeah, so you're not necessarily saying that I want to have the longest life, or I want to have the life most jam-packed with impactful experiences, which could be good or bad. You're saying I want to expand the capacity of the base experience. So I want to have the broadest possible template to have whatever experiences I may have or choose to have, which may also be length of life, right? I think that's why a lot of us value a long life, is because it gives us opportunity to experience many different things, right? It forms a basis for other experiences. Yeah. Anyway, is that all I want to say about subjective notions of welfare, subjective notions of well-being. Yeah. Part 2. Other humans exist. Do they? There's an interesting shift here, because, or to me, it's interesting that he went with humans rather than persons, right? That's an important distinction. Because I can say I exist, and I have an experience. I know I have an experience because I'm the one having it. What can I say about other people? Can I say that other people have experiences? This in philosophy is the problem of other minds. Do other things that look like me have an internal life or an internal experience that's either similar to mine, or do they have one at all? How do I know that? I mean, intuitively, we kind of assume that they do, but what is a good reason for that? I can't really speak to where the debate is on that, because it's not one that I really ever followed or looked into. I just know that that question exists. I mean, I know some of like the stock answers, like, oh, it's because we infer based, because they have similar behavior. So like inference to based explanation, they have similar minds to us because we act the same, so etc., etc. But I don't know it much past that. Yeah, and so when you say other humans exist, humans sounds to me more like you're just saying there are other, like, it's almost like biological. There are other beings wandering around with bodies, right? There are things of the same species as I am, which seems to be, if you're already like granting the existence of an external world, seems relatively uncontroversial. Like there are human animals running around, which could logically, I don't know, still allow the possibility that other persons don't exist. If you think like some sort of interiority, subjectivity is crucial to being, there being other persons. I don't know. Other humans have an experience. Okay, so here we go. Other humans have an experience like mine. I mean, a lot of people would be perfectly willing to grant this. I mean, as I was talking about, it does lead you into the problem of other minds, which is like one of those kind of stock philosophy problems, like the problem of free will or external world skepticism, right? The problem of other minds. Do other humans have experiences like I do? But yeah, you can just, if you want to state it axiomatically, you can go right ahead if you're being clear about that. And also, it's just intuitively not controversial. And other humans want to maximize their experience. Okay, I want to maximize my experience. They want to maximize their experience. Not clear quite yet what maximize means. But the important thing is that it's, because we're talking about desire here, that's why, not just simply existence. This is why I think this is going to form the basis of some moral claims, and that it's based on something subjective. I think is going to be, what generates controversy and problems and separates it from other notions of well-being, or what is desirable in the universe. Number 3, humans synergize to create better experiences. Yeah, that was a reference to what maximize experience meant. Yeah, I figured. Could have meant. Expand the capacity of the base experience. I'm still not sure. Yeah, I don't know. What is a base experience? We mean like baseline? So we're not talking about like better or worse. Just like what increases your capacity just to simply have experience, neither good nor bad. And what would expand your capacity to simply have experiences? Being, I mean, are there some intelligence factors that come in, like having greater knowledge, sensitivity to facts and sensory information? Excuse me. It's the COVID. Humans synergize to create better experiences. Yeah. So it's something like we're fundamental, something about sociality, right? That human beings are social. There is no human without the social aspect, um, and we rely on that to improve our lot in life. If I synergize with others, I will maximize my experience. Others will synergize with me to maximize their experience. Okay. I mean, you could, you know, be picky about this philosophically, but taking it face value, right? Just like, you know, people are social. We work together. We get a lot of our positive experiences and sense of well-being from our interactions with others and vice versa. And we look for those things with others. Yeah. I don't believe that moral facts exist. Oh, Jesus. Oh, Lord. We're into the moral non-realism. Man, moral non-realism is so pervasive these days. It's kind of funny because I think in the recent Phil Papers survey, most philosophers came back as being some variety of moral realist. But for a lot of people, you give them like a little bit of meta ethics, and they're like, "Oh yeah, moral facts don't exist." They just like they get totally uh, skeptical about moral facts or moral realism very easily and very quickly with just a little bit of philosophy. Maybe this is a feature of philosophical skepticism generally, right? You go to like a philosophy 101 class and you're like, bro, I don't even know if the external world exists. Do my hands even exist? What's going on? Do other minds, free will, morality, they're all a lie. But then you like get a PhD in philosophy and you're like, yeah, sure. Other minds exist. Moral facts, sure. External world, sure. Whether you have good reasons for it or not, I don't know. I assume someone does. Or else where would we be? I don't believe that moral facts exist, or if they do, I don't believe they are perceivable to us. I'm going to assume that using a form of perception here is metaphorical. Although I understand in metaethics they do talk about moral perception, like how do you look at a bunch of non-moral facts? Oh, he did this thing and took that from there, and then you come up with a moral judgment. Oh, that was immoral. That was a bad thing that he did. And so they ask, well, how did you see the morality in this? You know, in the same way that you could like look at a bunch of colors and shapes and see a car or something like that. But it seems weird to me. Like, this is a problem I have with a lot of meta ethics, is that it feels like it models the way it assumes the world should work from other things. So, for example, you know, how do we perceive the shape of something? Well, you assume that it has something to do with like the actual volume and dimensions and how many atoms something is made up of, right? And so you could maybe tell some plausible story that links what you perceive about the object to physical facts about it that correspond, right? If you're like, you know, there's more or less pedantic ways to cash out a correspondence theory of truth, but I'm like a very, you know, philosophically naive, easy to use sense, you know, like, how do you know something's true? I have a belief that there is a cat in their freezer. Why is that true? Why do I think it's true? Well, I go open the freezer and there's a cat inside there, right? There's something in the world that's corresponding to my belief about it. And so people take this model and then they think about moral fact, and it's like, oh, I think that what that person did was wrong. But then where do I check? What freezer do I open to check that, to find the wrongness of what happened? You know, I have this belief about something in the world, that a wrong thing happened, but there's nothing that seems to correspond to it, right? So what am I perceiving? Where does that property come from? And I think that that's just a weird way to think about it. I mean, that's a really weird way to think about it. And it's probably, I think, what the model that people are bringing that then causes them to fall into moral non-realism. Because they're like, well, I don't see the wrongness, so I don't think it exists. I don't think that there are moral facts out there. Like there's wrongness floating around in the world and it alights on something and then I see it, right? I don't think that that's the case because that seems silly. When it is silly, that's because you've assumed the wrong sort of model for what the kind of perception or cognition that's happening there. Yeah. I don't believe moral facts exist, or if they do, I don't believe that they're perceivable to us. Even that caveat, this distinction, right, it means that you're assuming that it's possible for a moral fact to exist independently of any human being's ability to perceive it. So it's almost like you're saying that a moral fact must be like a natural kind that could exist in the universe prior to or independent of any person or mental faculty there to like get at it, right? Which is weird because I don't think moral facts are like that. Moral facts are not like how many protons an atom has or something like that. You know, if a moral fact is anything, it's going to be like a social fact, like, you know, those two people are married. Do marriages exist in the fundamental structure of the universe? No, they don't. You're not going to find marriages in the universe prior to there being societies and people who get married. But does that mean that there are no facts of the matter about who is married and who isn't, or whether marriages even exist? Of course not. Anyway. Therefore, I build all of my policy positions from this fundamental moral framework of there being no moral facts. What moral framework? I think about policy positions in a similar way that Rawls' veil of ignorance would demand of us. Society should be constructed in a way that should be. Why should they be? Moral facts don't exist. In a way that maximizes the experience of as many people as possible. This means satisfying as many people's needs and desires. I mean, I don't think that's what... Is that what Rawls' veil of ignorance would demand of us? That we construct in a way that maximizes the experience of as many people as possible? Is Rawls like a subjective well-being or happiness maximizer? I don't think he is, because a whole lot of what he was about was like trying to justify inequalities on the basis of fairness. So I think in like a Rawlsian society, what the veil of ignorance gets you is people, you know, you could get some distribution of well-being where some people might be doing not so great. But if the veil of ignorance has granted you, has led you to assess that structure of difference is fair, such that you'd be willing to enter into that society at any point, because the overall is better. So it's like there's a local optimum. Yeah, I don't know. I don't feel like I understand enough about Rawls to be able to say if this is a good like one sentence summary that the veil of ignorance demands that society should be constructed in a way that maximizes the experience of as many people as possible. That just sounds like straightforward utilitarianism. I don't know that Rawls is a straightforward utilitarian. I'm just not sure. Welcome to the welcome to the I should have researched more regret stream. This means satisfying as many people's needs and desires as possible. Yeah, but you see with Roll, there's like so many caveats there. He's not? Who's not? Someone, a wild elf in pog form has appeared. Yeah, he's not a pure utilitarian, right? Because, yeah, am I correct? Like, his whole thing is justifying non-maximal utilitarianism, right? It's like what counts as a fair system for not being a straightforward utilitarian. Like, is that a fair summary of like what Rawls is trying to do? Like, how do we get away with not being a straightforward utilitarians, but it's fine because it's fair, right? He's been sounding more virtue ethicist recently in the advent of the red pill arc. Oh goodness, a red pill arc. Yeah, virtue ethics. I mean, going from moral non-realism to virtue ethics, it's like the greatest hits of ethical theories that I don't like. Let me tell you what my problems with virtue ethics are. One, it's conservative. It's like, oh, how do I be a good person? Oh, just do what like the good people are doing. Okay, like that's so parochial. It's like, you're supposed to like look to what are like exemplars of virtue in your society, and find the mean for, establish. So think about it this way. And again, I haven't read Alistair McIntyre. I'm a complete amateur. So virtue ethics experts out there, go easy on me. But this is my impression. Virtue ethics, you want to try and find the mean between two extremes, because that's where the virtue lies. So where you want to be in between being a coward and being overly brash, is that it? You want to have the right mix of prudence and boldness that makes you into a courageous person, right? That's a virtue you want to cultivate, is being courageous. And so there's not rules that you have to follow to be courageous. You simply have to cultivate the characteristic of being a courageous person, which is very particular. It's particular to specific contexts and situations. And it's a skill that you practice. It's like a knowledge how rather than a knowledge that. And some of that knowledge how you can acquire from looking to exemplars, like people who are already agreed upon as being courageous people. So think about what you're doing here. You're already setting up these two concepts of being brash and cowardly. That's going to be very dependent. What counts as brash or cowardly is going to be very dependent on the culture and the social milieu that you're coming up in, right? Likewise, who your exemplars are is going to be very dependent on the people in your society. And that sounds pretty good descriptively of like how we actually do a lot of morality, but it sounds like it's going to be inherently conservative because it's not going to challenge us when we need to like radically break from what is conventionally acceptable in our society, as in many times in history we have had to do, right? Very often your society is just bad at something and wrong about a lot of things, and in order to evolve morally, we cannot take cues from who is held up as an exemplar in our society. Like, it seems like virtue ethics would be perfectly compatible with living in an honor society where, I don't know, you like kill people who bring dishonor to your family or something like that, right? What's to say that that's a bad virtue? If your society values honor, you'd be like, I'm cultivating the virtue of being honorable. How am I doing that? Well, I'm just killing my family member who brought dishonor on my family, right? That doesn't seem right. Next is, so in addition to being conservative, I think virtue ethics is a lot of times just devoid of useful content. So a lot of times we have very, very specific moral problems that we face in front of us, and we need to figure out what to do. And just saying, well, like, bro, just do what a virtuous person would do. Like, it's not helpful. doesn't have any content to it. Like sometimes we actually do need principles, basically, or rules. That's why sometimes I say virtue ethics is like vibe-based morality. Just like go by your vibes, just vibe with it, and that's not good. I don't know how a red pill arc gets you to virtue ethics. But yeah, I think sometimes we should act like virtue ethicists, but only because it helps us with like calculation problems. Because like very often in life, we can't be bogged down by thinking about principles and figuring out exactly what's right or wrong. Right? We just have to act, and so cultivating virtue is an important part of being moral, but for pragmatic or prudential reasons. But it's not like the ground of morality. It's not what it means to be moral. It's just a way of being moral in sort of like a day-to-day sort of way. Lol, so true. But like, does that come with like a grinning soy jack face? Anyway, where were we? We're talking about rules veil of ignorance. This means satisfying as many people view this as being similar to a sort of Pareto efficiency that could exist in how we reallocate goods and services. Oof, this paragraph, there's so much happening here. It's hard to know how any of this like is not just completely undermined by saying that moral facts don't exist, because you've kind of gone from this observational thing about how I have experience, I want to maximize my experience, other people have experiences, they want to maximize their experience. When we work together in a certain way, we all get more maximized experience. But then society should be constructed in a way that maximizes experience, right? You've made a jump from, before I say this, I want to say that I am a little bit wary of people who say is ought distinction or naturalistic fallacy, as if like you're just, I don't know, like that's a knockdown criticism of any kind of moving from statements or observations to moral oughts. I think it's much more complicated than saying that you just simply cannot move from is to ought. I think it's more complicated than that. But I think, if you go and look at what Hume wrote about this, usually Hume is referenced the most, is that he was actually, I think he wasn't like dismissing moving from is to ought just out of hand and saying it's impossible. He was just saying you can't do it like just automatically. There needs to be an argument. And so here it's very, very strange to go from observations, then to say I don't think moral facts exist, then to go into what is essentially a normative or moral judgment. Right? There needs to be something in between that says, okay, I have an observation. Here's a normative claim based on that observation, and here's why it's compatible with there also not being any moral facts. Okay, let me catch up on some chat here. I think people are always going with vibes, though. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, this is like a human psychology point. We're very vibe-based when it comes to morality. They will follow their professed principles only as far as the vibes remain acceptably groovy, and when they become ungroovy, they abandon their principles or reformulate them, or gin up some reason why they don't apply. Yeah. I mean, just as a fact of human psychology, that's true. We're a lot of our morality, just as an observational point, is vibe-based, self-serving, prone to confabulation, revised for completely irrelevant reasons. Yeah, the is-ought thing is dumb. It's only significant in the context of formal proofs, formal logic rather. What statements are is statements. To say this ought to be the case is to assert that this is the situation. Yeah, if you're a moral realist, then yeah, observations, claims about oughts are just claims about facts that pertain in the world. One funny example I like to bring up is You can make an observational statement. John promised Jane to do X, and then move straight to a ought statement. Therefore, John ought to do X. And the ought is directly implied by the is on a correct conceptual analysis of what a promise is, because a promise is a way of self-generating an obligation. A promise creates an obligation and is also the justification for that promise. No, wait. A promise creates an obligation and is also itself the justification for that obligation. It's self-contained. So if John promises Jane to do something, the promise itself, by describing the promise, you're also describing an obligation that exists, and an obligation is an ought to do something. Ma-oughts, yeah. Take the hate pill. You mean Jonathan Haidt, be a virtue ethicist based on moral foundation theory. Is that where Haidt goes with moral foundations theory? He goes in the direction of virtue ethics? Yeah. So one way which I like to describe my support of virtue ethics and my support of deontology is that I think that deontology, or like a Kantian ethics, and virtue ethics are kind of like a software. They're like a moral app that you can run, but the fundamental hardware, I think, is utilitarian. So that sometimes you get better utilitarian outcomes by acting like a virtue ethicist, or by being concerned about virtues, or acting like a Kantian. What becomes circular? What about promises? Yeah, I guess, but I think it's like what's supposed to be weird about promises is that they are circular, but they're like, that's just how they function. That's what's weird about promises. There's actually, like, I think some interesting philosophical literature about promises and why they function as self-justifying obligations. Yeah. Okay, so this very, very confusing paragraph, I have to say, I'd have a lot of questions. Maybe it's explained in depth in the video, like as you were saying, it's just a summary here, just a very, very brief summary. And you get, and this is just sort of like Cliff Notes points on what gets explained further in the video. I don't know. On maximizing one's experience. Okay, so maybe here we're gonna get a good sense of what it means to maximize experience, although maybe gave a clue here. Satisfying as many people's needs. So maximizing experience is satisfying your needs and desires. Yeah, I mean, just a note, there's a big difference between satisfying needs and satisfying desires. And arguably a lot of really big social issues come about with regards to questions on how to balance those. How do you balance meeting someone's needs versus meeting their desires? Which take precedence, and when, and how much? The video is long and boring and a lot of bad MS Paint. So are we doing a better job just by reading this? But I mean, boring but like useful, boring and explanatory, boring and enlightening. Like it actually sorts some of this stuff out. To make a promise has the illocutionary effect of creating an obligation to fulfill that parts. Yeah. But you might, yes, maybe someone could argue, and you know, that creation of an obligation is purely conventional or something like that. It's not like a obligation in like a deep moral fact sort of way that we're interested in. Yeah. I discussed a little bit of that stuff in that video I did on New Year's resolutions. Because one of the ways that people see resolutions is as a self-promise, like a promise to yourself, right? So you say New Year's Day comes around, you're like, I promise I'm going to go to the gym every day. And so people say, well, what's going on there? What's happening? And one theory is that it's making a promise to yourself. But there was a line in Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, just like a throwaway line, where he says something like, a person cannot make a promise to themselves because a promise can be dissolved by the person who is promised to with no moral residue. So since you're promising yourself, you can simply dissolve your own promise with no moral residue or loss at all. In other words, like no moral penalty, so to speak. And then he says, well, that's not binding at all. There's nothing binding about that. So it's like but resolutions are supposed to be binding in some way. You're supposed to be like binding yourself to a course of action. But on that model of promises, there's no binding property that promises can have when they apply to yourself. Something like that. So resolutions have to be something different. It's explanatory. Okay, so you mean it's like actually it would be useful if someone wants to go into detail. Okay. Okay, on maximizing one's experience. Within the statements of my foundational beliefs, I often talk about maximizing one's own experience and helping others maximize theirs. I often run into a problem where people assume the most naive construction of this idea possible. It is assumed, especially when words like hedonism and egoism get used, that I conceptualize the moral world to be one where everyone just does whatever they want, be it murdering, stealing, etc., because it makes them happy. It is also assumed that I make no distinction between lower and higher pleasures. This is obviously a ridiculous position to hold, and just a slightly fairer reading will get us to construct more reasonable interpretations of what it means to maximize one's experience. It's obviously ridiculous to not distinguish between lower and higher pleasures. I mean, I remember in like undergrad when we talked about utilitarianism and we were talking about, because if I remember correctly, Bentham was one of the first to like really give some substance to utilitarianism. I say that very reservedly because I don't want to say he invented utilitarianism or was the origin of it, because you can always find something like ancient philosophy or Eastern philosophy that has some of the same features. But let's say Bentham, right? He's one of the OGs. He's one of the original guys. He had a very like singular notion of utility, right? There's just simply utility. And then it was John Stuart Mill who later wanted to distinguish between higher and lower pleasures. And I remember in undergraduate years when this discussion came up, a lot of people thought that move was weird, to distinguish between higher and lower pleasures. That seemed kind of odd. Because it kind of almost sounds self-serving. Like you want to say that the things that you enjoy are higher pleasures, and the things that other people enjoy, aka, I don't know, poor people, are like the lower pleasures and are not of the same stature or shouldn't be valued as much. So when we arrange our society along utilitarian lines, we want to say that we should arrange it in a way to maximize the better experiences, the ones where we're doing the Sunday crossword and going out to brunch, rather than the ones that, you know, like the poor uneducated people are into, like, I don't know, going to the Sunday football game. I don't know. Yeah. I remember a lot of people were very suspicious about this movie because also I think Mill gives like a weird kind of way to sort out what was higher or lower. Where it's like the people who have experienced both and choose the one, that's the higher, but then the people who just experienced the one, you just kind of discount their opinion on it. So bubblegum guns, it seems just like adding qualifiers to guide the result to what one actually wants as a result. Yeah, I think that was the suspicion, is that it sounds like, what do you call it? Like an ad hoc kind of system. Where you say, oh, we need to like maximize utility, so we want to like make everyone happy. And it's like, oh, well, you know what? Actually, like the majority of people are like really happy with watching 4 hours of TV a day and then just getting drunk on the weekends. So we got to maximize that. And they're like, no, we don't want to do that. We want to maximize things that I enjoy, which is reading philosophy books and going to art galleries and I don't know, stuff like that. The good stuff. Oh, there was a joke I remember. I still remember this joke. This is so many years ago. Someone in one of my undergrad classes. Actually, I can't repeat it here, but it was good. Just imagine a really good joke making fun of John Stuart Mill for distinguishing higher and lower pleasures. Just imagine a funny joke. Ignore the first part. No, it was good. I just caught you so unawares with that funny anecdote that you couldn't contain it. Okay, where are we going? A thought experiment I often use is the following. You and 4 friends enter a room with 5 candy bars. You can either eat all the candy bars because it would maximize your experience, or you could share the candy equally. The naive construction of my belief would entail the former, but let's think about the consequences of this. My friends are now unhappy. They might not want to be friends with me anymore next time they want to share with me, and really the outcome is in the long run and potentially even immediately, I've certainly not maximized my... Okay, but the goal is still to maximize your experience. Our friends being sad would make me sad, then not being friends with me anymore would be upsetting. You can imagine the rest. Okay. So this is just basically like, instead of self-interest, it's enlightened self-interest, where instead of just doing what you want to do for yourself immediately, you occasionally do things for other people, because in the long run, that's also doing something for yourself. But in the end, you're doing something for yourself. So, in the end, it doesn't really, I think, escape the hedonism or the egoism charge. You're just saying, so someone's like, oh, so you're just a hedonist or an egoist? And you're like, no, I'm not a hedonist or an egoist. I'm a smart hedonist or egoist. In other words, when I say I want to maximize my experience, I don't do things that affect my experience negatively. That's what I mean. And it's like, oh, well, that's just what we assumed you meant anyway. Okay. I'm sounding more snarky than I should be, but basically what I want to say is, like, I can understand the challenge he wants to hit off here, is that you say, oh, I want to, like, maximize, okay, we'll just say happiness. I want to maximize happiness for myself. People will say, oh, that would make you immoral because you're just going to do shitty things that are going to help you. You're just going to live out your favorite American Psycho meme. And then you can say, well, no, because my self-interest involves other people, which would be shocking to a libertarian. But for most people, it's like, well, yeah, that's obvious. It's obvious that for many of us, what is in our best interest is also another best interest. What is that line from? Was it Adam Smith who said, you get your morning bread from the baker, not because the baker cares about you. The baker doesn't give a shit about you. The baker cares about themselves, and that's why they get up at 4 a.m. to bake the bread, and that's why you get the bread cheap and on time. I don't know why I brought that up. Does that make sense? Yeah. It's for the baker, doing stuff for themselves means doing stuff for other people that other people want, and that's good for other people. And it's the same for all of us, because we're social beings. You can't escape that. It is clear then when I say maximizing experience that we have to take a more intelligent long-term holistic view. Okay. Towards what this actually means. If I start with 0 utils, get your calculators out, and I can get 100 now or 25 every year for the rest of my life. In 4 years, I've already surpassed the experience maximization potential for the first option. If I do something that makes me happy at the detriment of those around me, which makes my experience at the end a net negative anyway, clearly I haven't maximized my experience. I mean, I can be like flippant about this, like, oh yeah, that's obvious, of course, right? But I think a lot of people lose this perspective when it comes to political matters, especially in American politics, because there's this like hyper individualism in American politics, which I think is valuable and should be preserved. I do think that the individual should be the basic measure of political thinking, or the basic unit of political thinking. Precisely because any single time you try to abstract up to like thinking about the group, you're not actually thinking about the group, you're just thinking about some other guy, right? But I think even so, when people think about politics, they should think more about how their well-being is dependent on the well-being of people around them. So for example, if you're a rich person, you know, you can be as rich as anything, but if you are living in a society of people who are poor and desperate and uneducated and sick, pretty soon that's going to make your life worse. And that if you can do stuff to make the world better for people around you, it's going to make your life better too. So that's a very useful perspective to have, I think, in politics, and which I think a lot of political ideologies or people of a particular ideological bent tend to overlook. Right? You can be as rich as anything, but if the person who lives over the fence is poor and desperate and sick and uneducated, it's going to affect you. Right? You want the people around you to be in a good way. I would hope that this is straightforward and obvious watching it from the start. Oh, like you can just, yeah, like T-bowing it, right? I'd hope that this is straightforward and obvious to understand. However, it appears to be a tripping point either due to a lack of thought or bad faith on the part of many people I interact with. Yeah, I mean, I have a sense that we're looking back in time here, like really early debates that happened in the Twitch, whatever streaming space, right, where people were getting mad about self-interest versus enlightened self-interest, and whether you should think about other people or not. Violence. I'm generally opposed to violence as I don't believe it is an effective way to accomplish political change. At least not at this point in time in the United States. I wonder if that's a caveat that you add because you're like, well, you know, we did have to have a revolutionary war to free ourselves from the British. The violence was right then. Or, you know, we did have to fight the Confederacy, etc., etc. That being said, I believe there are plenty of groups of people who could, at points, justify the use of violence in self-defense, even if I don't believe it would be pragmatic or politically effective thing to do. Well, what's more pragmatic than self-defense? Yeah, what is being alluded to here? I believe that there are plenty of groups of people who could, at points, justify the use of violence in self-defense. What groups could use violence in self-defense? Yeah, I don't know. And also maybe, yeah, this kind of suggestion of a right to self-defense, even if it is not pragmatic. I know there is some literature in the philosophy of self-defense about whether you're justified in undertaking actions of self-defense if you believe that they will not be successful. I'll leave that to the to our dear readers to think of the examples that could fit that sort of case. Running low on coffee. Things are going downhill. Defense of property. You know, is there anything you want to say about violence? Political violence? Yeah, I don't like political violence. Not good. I think a lot of times politics is like the business of having the kids get along without tearing each other apart, basically. You know, maybe not, if you're very cynical, you could say that politics is not even about like coming up with good policies or having the voice of the people be heard or anything like that. Politics is purely what we do so that people don't uh, fight each other physically. That's all it is. And that's fine. And that's good. That's what we want, right? Because as long as people are not fighting each other in the streets, most people will be free to get along with their lives, do what they need to do. Society will keep chugging along. The bakers will still keep getting your bread out on time as part of their own self-interest, and we'll get along and things will be. Anyway, defensive property. I believe that people have a right to defend their property insofar as three important criteria are met. One, you possess the property in a way that your state and community recognizes your possession. Insofar as three important criteria are met. Okay, so these I imagine are inclusive criteria. So all three have to be met. Number two, you have reasonably exhausted non-violent options to protect your property. Three, the other person is effectively on notice and understands they exist in an environment where another person will protect their property. Okay, we've got some chats here. A suicide bomber attacking oppressive occupiers could be considered self-defense, but not necessarily pragmatic. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you're assuming, yeah, I mean, the context there is very important, right? You talk about a suicide bomber attacking people who could be identified as enemy combatants in some asymmetrical armed conflict. But I mean, because you must be talking about self-defense for the group, because it can't be self-defense for the suicide bomber to blow themselves up, right? It's the opposite of self-defense. So it's self-defense of, it's the individuals acting in the self-defense of the state or of their group, but not necessarily pragmatic. Yeah, I mean, it's weird though, because, what do you mean by pragmatic? So I assume that you'd say it's not pragmatic because it would have negative consequences. It would actually harm their own group because maybe it would justify like retaliation or something like that. So that's the question, right? So let's say your group is being attacked. And so you think, I need to defend my group. So I'm going to take up a gun and go and shoot a individual, like a soldier who is acting on behalf of this group that's attacking us. But I know that if I do that, they're going to retaliate and kill 10 of my compatriots, right? 10 of my people in my group. If I know that, am I acting in self-defense? And by self-defense, I don't mean for myself. The self is the self of the group, the group's self, whatever kind of self a group has, right? It seems to me you're not, right? Because you're doing something that you know is going to bring about, like, not change the situation that your group is in, but make it worse. That's not self-defense, that's self-harm. You need to be, I think, more specific about what the pragmatic, like what the actual practical consequences we're talking about here. Bubblegum gun. Violence is a natural part of creation. Cowardice is in the now will lead to greater violence down the road. Better to have violence in the moment. Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes that's true. So, for example, I think in the case of like the Russia-Ukraine war, a further policy of appeasement towards Russia would not have secured peace in the long term, and that assisting Ukraine in defending themselves works more towards securing peace in the long term. In the same way as, like when Hitler was acting up in Europe, appeasement didn't help, I guess, is the received wisdom from that situation. And that at some point you have to stand up to tyrants with violence to get them to stop their shenanigans. As for saying that it's like natural part of creation, I don't know, it sounds a little bit mystical, a little bit of naturalism bias for me. But yeah, I'm not opposed to violence in any and all circumstances. Certainly not. I think, but I definitely don't have a clear, I would say I admit I don't have a clear idea about when it's justified or not. I guess you could say, in cases where all of your standard procedural, I hope democratic means are exhausted for doing something. And it can't just be like, oh, I want different tax policy and I've tried all democratic means to get that to happen. And since I can't, I have to take up arms against the state. It has to be like on certain issues that are of a certain import that then it becomes justified. But even then, I think I've seen some empirical research where they found that like non-violent resistance against the state turns out to be more effective than violent resistance against the state. Violent revolutions tend to foster or create authoritarian regimes. And a lot of our modern democracies, like especially even in, I think in a lot of Eastern countries, like Korea, I know, they just like evolved their way out of authoritarian dictatorships. I mean, there were some violent protests along the way, but there wasn't like a coup or an armed revolution or anything like that. Same thing happened in South Africa. There was violence, and to be sure, but there wasn't like a violent overthrow of the state in order to replace it, I think. And there was a lot of non-violent means of putting pressure on the apartheid government in South Africa. I'm sure a lot of smart people have written about which factors had more effect or not. But ultimately, it was the state made the decision to bow to the pressure and say, okay, fine, we're going to have elections, etc. Right? So my bias, my intuition is to say, go with the non-violent routes. It's not as flashy, it's not as sexy, it doesn't feel like it will get you the same results in a short amount of time. But I think there's enough evidence that non-violence works, especially in today's world, right, where things are very interconnected and international pressure counts for a lot. Like maybe 100, 200 years ago, having to pick up arms to get what you want was a lot more, I think, more practically necessary than what it is today. You have a lot of avenues. Here, so wait, I want to go over these 3 criteria. You have a right to defend your property insofar as these 3 important. You possess the property in a way that your state and community recognizes your possession. This is problematic. There's a problem here, I should say. Think of this case. So you're going back to 1930s Germany. All of a sudden, the state, and let's say you're a Jewish person, all of a sudden the state and the community, as in the majority of Germans, no longer recognizes your property, you as having right to your property. So you own a business. The state says this business no longer belongs to you legally, and the rest of the vast majority of German populace goes with that and says, yeah, we don't think that you have a right to this property as a Jewish person, right? So now, does that mean that you have no right to defend that property? Because your possession of that property is not recognized by the state or your community. See, libertarians would say, no, that there's like a deeper right to property that is like more foundational than simply what the state or the community recognizes. There's like some sort of like a natural right to certain property. And sometimes they will like hash that out in a Lockean sense, that whatever you have mixed your labor with, you have a right to. You have reasonably exhausted non-violent options to protect your property. Yeah, I mean, sure, but reasonably is going to be doing a lot of work there. And the other person is effectively unnoticed and understands that they exist in an environment. So you can only defend your property if you're in an environment where people are already assuming that defense of property is going to take place. So what kind of cases is this trying to head off? I don't know. This is bizarre. I watched Destiny, I watched your 1K views, top 10 philosophy paper video, and subbed, and now you're talking about him. Can't tell if it's a coincidence. I don't think it's a coincidence. Libertarian believe in God-given rights. God-given? Don't they believe in something that doesn't... I don't think they would prefer a secular interpretation of rights, right? I'm sure some have like an idea of God-given rights. I just don't know where those would come from, right? What part of the Bible do you read to figure out what rights you have? Yeah. I mean, I'm not familiar with libertarian philosophy generally, but my sense was that they have an idea of natural rights. So it's something that you can derive from reason and thinking about the world, and they don't want to... what I imagined was that most would not want to base it on anything to do with the divine. That's hard to get broad-based agreement on. But if you can say, oh no, all you need is just your brain and the world, and we can get you a theory of natural rights, that seems like a lot more powerful and a better thing to base your ideology on. Yeah. Let's plow ahead. I know where we're going with this. It's a mixed bag, yeah. They do seem like a mixed bunch. I like seeing stuff on Twitter where it's like libertarians fighting with the Libertarian Party, where a lot of libertarians are just like, the Libertarian Party is just like weird. we don't understand or relate to them at all. Oh man, what did I do to my hair here? Okay, what are we talking about? Yeah, right to defense of property. Sure. I mean, a lot of this, I mean, what I have to assume, and please don't take this the wrong way, is that in the background, a lot of this is a very acute case of America brain, right? Because even amongst the most liberal Americans, there's somewhere in the background America brain, which is like, this is my stuff, and I'm gonna kill people who try to take my stuff, right? I'm only half kidding. For example, if someone wants to destroy your local business or your house, then you have the right to defend your property by all means necessary. All means necessary? Be careful with your words there. Many disagreements over whether or not defense of personal property is justified sometimes appear to boil down to a difference of underlying values. The value in question is whether property can be valued over human life, or some statement to that effect. In my experience, middle class and wealth people may underestimate the personal sacrifice and the years of time invested into obtaining a business, a car, or even something as simple as a stereo system or a school instrument. As such, they will argue that no matter the value and sacrifice associated with some property, even in the case of people living in poverty, the life of the thief always outweighs said value. This is a conclusion I take issue with. Yeah. I mean, I understand what's going on here, right? So it's something like, maybe there's some riot going on and someone wants to come burn down your laundromat or something like that. And you pull out a gun and start gunning them down. And some people will say, but, why do you want to take a human life? Just let the insurance handle it. Or, no possession of yours is worth stacking up against another human's life. And what he's saying is that for a lot of people, those things are more important than what you give them credit for. Yeah, by all means, opens car trunk to reveal a lost Soviet nuke. I'm gonna defend my property, bitches. I see a film like that. Someone just nukes some rioters. Yeah, so I'm kind of sympathetic to this view because I think sometimes if you are like middle class and up, you tend to lose perspective on how integral certain material facts are, or even including material objects are, to people's well-being and by extension their sense of self. So like if you are a working class family who's worked very hard to like build this small business and all of your wealth is tied up in it and your income, and it's the leverage you use for all your loans, it's the thing you're going to give your kids when you retire, right? It's going to feel like a part of yourself, like something you cannot lose, right? Because so much of your time, your hope, your future is invested in it. And also just like in a less philosophical tone, being more sensitive to how precarious a lot of people's life situations are, that they cannot simply like afford to lose a car and get it back in insurance later, right? Because they need to be at work tomorrow or else they get fired or else they can't make rent or something like that. Like it's like a matter of survival whether they have a bicycle or a car or whatever. Yeah. So I mean I can see what's being headed off there. But then on the other side there's another case of, you know, what I'd call America brain, which is where you see a lot of Americans are just like, someone tries to take your stuff, you can just shoot them. You have the right to shoot anyone who tries to take your stuff. It doesn't matter what it is. It's your stuff. They should know. So yeah, I mean, I get the sentiment. Be a little more sympathetic to people's material circumstances and how that might motivate them to defend, or to feel that they ought to defend their property with violence. But at the same time, I would say, you know, don't let your America brain control you too much. Protesting and rioting. Oh, here we go. I ardently believe in people's right to protest, and I'll always support the right to protest, even if I don't necessarily agree with positions being advocated for by any particular protest. For example, I would support the right of a pro-life group protesting the right to an abortion, but I wouldn't agree with the message of the pro-life group that abortion is immoral or should be outlawed. Rioting is a slightly more complicated matter. When I speak about rioting, I'm more precisely talking about protests that have. Am I reading this right? I'm more precisely talking about protests that have some level of violence involved, namely that of property destruction. I do not support riots which seek to harm individuals in the United States at this point in time. Why specifically the United States? You can harm individuals in Canada. That's fine. Just take it back to the Canadians. I don't mind. I only support rioting against institutions that represent some oppressive force in society. So I generally only support rioting against public institutions, a police department, city hall, etc. It's not inconceivable that I would support a riot against a private institution, but only if that private institution was acting in an illegal manner. It's like a very limited notion of rioting. It's like, have your riot, make sure not to harm any people, and only damage objects or buildings associated with the oppressive government force that you're rioting against. I mean, even this, like, what are you achieving? You're mad at the government, so you go burn down City Hall? I mean, what's the justification here? Why even support those riots? I mean, again, I wish I had this stuff on hand, but I remember seeing some empirical. There was a guy who posted a link to some empirical study, and he was like, it was either after or during the Black Lives Matter protests. He posted something that said, like, historically, these sorts of protests actually have backlash effects that like negate the policies that they're trying to enact. And he was fired. He was kicked out of his university. It was seen as like too controversial to post that at that time, even though that was like the type of research that he worked in. So I mean, personally, I'm pretty skeptical of the ability, capacity of riots to solve anything. I mean, the only time I think rioting could possibly be justified is if you're operating in a situation where there has been a complete breakdown in like conventional procedures for getting things done. I have a suspicion that riots will always cause backlash effects against your cause or what you're trying to get done. They'll justify crackdowns. They'll turn the public against you. They will damage communities. They'll cause businesses to leave because they feel like communities are insecure. Yeah. I mean, there's really, I mean, I guess here, this is the positions part, right? He's just talking about what his positions are. There's no real argument here for why this should be accepted. MLK and riots. So, assume this is Martin Luther King is commonly cited as opposition to my position on riots. However, I believe this is due to misunderstanding. Selective quotes on MLK. This I think is just, I'm not interested in this. It's kind of struck me as a little bit weird in recent years to see this kind of adjudication trying to figure out, you know, like, what would Martin Luther King do? Or what would Martin Luther King say about this? I don't know. If you're a historian, that's interesting, but why, what relevance does it have? Does it lend support to riots? Should you support riots if MLK supported riots? That doesn't follow. Maybe in like some inductive way, right? Like, well, I trust his moral intuition more than my own because he got this other stuff right. So if he also supported this, therefore I should also support that. But that seems really weak to me. I mean, you could make that argument. I just don't think it's a very good one. So all this stuff, I'm not interested in any of this. It's not a debate. I think I mean, it's historically interesting. Like, oh, what would Martin Luther King have thought? But it seems like it's coming in here as like it's a reason and an argument against supporting riots. Like, you shouldn't support riots or you should support riots. Wait, it's commonly cited as opposition to my position. I didn't even know what your position about riots is. You're kind of for them, but kind of against them in some cases. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, just very briefly, it looks like maybe it's against. So, citing cases from MLK being against riots, right? Support your position on riots. So you're against riots, but actually, it turns out in a lot of cases, you're actually for riots. Like, I mean, I assume it's, you know, you want a higher bar for riots than just a company is acting illegally. I can riot against a company if they're acting illegally. That's all of them. Ugh. Yeah, but anyway, this stuff is like, it's not relevant. If you say like, I am, I'm against rioting, I think, violent political protests are counterproductive and morally suspect, and someone says, well, Martin Luther King would disagree, I would say, okay, and I guess he was wrong. Also, don't care. Public versus private humor. I enjoy all types of comedy, even if it's dark or offensive. Regardless of how I feel, there's a wide chasm between the types of humor that I enjoy privately and the types of humor I believe are responsibly enjoyed publicly. I believe that public figures have to be more careful when engaging with potentially problematic types of humor because one cannot control the audience that may engage with particular types of humor. Does there have to be here like a prudential one? Like just as a matter of being an intelligent person who operates in the world, you should be careful about what jokes you make in what contexts? Or like this is a moral imperative? Like, no, you have a moral duty to be careful. As public figures, we should avoid empowering groups of people who have ideologies rooted in... As public figures, we, okay, he's including himself, should avoid empowering groups of people who have ideologies rooted in values contradicting our own, even in speech actions where we do not intend to do so, but it still has that effect. Isn't there a lot of controversy around Destiny recently about him, like, platforming right-wingers or whatever? Avoid empowering groups of people. But he's talking here in the context of humor, right? So you have the ability to empower groups of people with bad ideologies through humor. As an example, okay, we have an example of a type of edgy joke might be the way I engage with a close friend relating to gender, sexuality, race. It might be an inside joke in private where my friend and I have cleared with each other that it's okay to joke about certain topics. If we were to engage in these types of humor publicly without a large number of disclaimers, it's entirely possible that people could take these jokes the wrong way and engage with them problematically. For Disney, make fun of XYZ for being gay. Now I'm going to make fun of other gay people because it was funny. Because of certain people obsessively trying to get optics victories over me, this entire argument becomes reframed by them as Destiny wants to say the N-word in private. I don't regularly use any hateful language in private, especially because I just don't know many jokes involving hateful language. However, that's not to say that there aren't any examples of such jokes. Ooh, and there's a link to YouTube. Risky click, not gonna do it. Yeah, streaming with Nick Fuentes. I don't know what happened there. Some people were like, you're too friendly with him, and some people were like, oh, you challenged him and then hung out. I don't know. I can't watch that stuff. It physically hurts. I mean, what's going on here? I mean, he's obviously heading off some criticisms that he's got, which is maybe where like edgy jokes he's made in private have come out. People have criticized him for it. And so he's making this public-private distinction about what sorts of jokes are appropriate. I think this is something that we understand intuitively, right? That different jokes, that a joke can be an okay in one, even like free of any like stuff that's like socially problematic or has to do with marginalized groups or anything like that. Even like a joke about, your uncle's haircut or something like that. Context where it's okay versus not okay. It's something which I think we intuitively understand. Yeah, I mean, the philosophy and ethics of humor. I should have a lot more to say about this because it's something which I actually have read about, but it feels like there's just so much and it's so complicated and I don't actually understand it that well. Public versus private humor. But yeah, I mean, I'm generally supportive of this idea of like humor in context. So when you go to, say, a stand-up show, you're entering into a certain space and taking things out of that space kind of like radically reframes what's being said in ways that can change the moral valence of what's being said in ways that's not accurate, right? And you often find these things where people don't understand the context that they're going into. So someone goes into a comedy show, and then the comedian makes a joke about blind people, and they're like, "Oh, but my brother is blind." It's like, so you're not in the space where that's a relevant claim that you can make on the performer. And especially because something which I've been hearing a lot from stand-up comedians in interviews is that they talk about their jokes as a kind of fiction. Even if they're recounting something in a way that sounds like they're saying their actual opinion or something that actually happened to them, they're like, no, it's like we might be drawing on personal experience, but you have to treat it as a kind of fiction. These are essentially stories, and they require a kind of buy-in that's the same kind of buy-in that you have to engage in when you sit down to watch a TV show or read a book or something like that. That you're entering into a different space where claims and beliefs have the little asterisk next to them that they are fictional beliefs and fictional claims, not actual claims or actual beliefs. And so they're not claims about the world or beliefs about the world, they're jokes. Yeah. Incest, oh boy. Incest as a topic has been explored quite extensively on my stream as a way to illustrate the concept of moral dumbfounding. Oh, interesting. You have a feeling that something is immoral or wrong, but find you are unable to explain exactly why you feel that way. It seems hard when pressed to explain exactly why an incestuous relationship is wrong without appealing to other arguments that aren't intrinsic to these kinds of relationships. For example, parent-child, these are wrong due to power differences or underage parties, not necessarily the fact that they're incestuous, or situations involving reproduction. Yeah, okay, so this is a bit of a confusing way to kind of allude to specific moral dumbfounding cases. I've used this topic several times on stream to see if someone is capable of actually engaging with the topic, though it generally devolves into people screaming at me while claiming I want yes, or something similarly absurd. It is a useful measure of someone's ability to engage with arguments in good faith, question their own worldview, and engage with the logic of ethical matters. While I usually frame the argument from a position of moral neutrality, I've previously made clear that I'm not in favor of incestual relationships and provided what I believe to be logical arguments for this. Okay, very strong. My t-shirt, which says I'm against incestuous relationships, is raising questions already answered by the t-shirt. But moral dumbfounding. There's a lot to say about moral dumbfounding. So for anyone who doesn't know, moral dumbfounding is supposed to refer to this phenomenon where there are these things that people think are right or wrong, and they tend to have very strong intuitions about it, but they cannot seem to access or verbalize reasons for why they think those things are wrong. So one example is you have like a flag of your country. You don't see any use for it, so you tear it up into rags and use them to clean your toilet. Is this right or wrong? You'll find a lot of people say there's something wrong about that. But you say, well, why is it wrong? Is anyone harmed? No. Are you harmed? No. Like, where does the wrong stem from? And people are like, I don't know, but it just seems wrong. You shouldn't do it. And a lot of debate has sprung up about exactly what the significance of these cases is. So some people have taken issue with the cases themselves, right? That they're not very well empirically studied, that they don't support the claims that are based on them. They ignore relevant differences between cases, all sorts of things. One way which you could go with them is that you could go the Humean route, like a skeptical route, and saying, okay, this tells us or shows us how a lot of our moral judgments, or most of our moral judgments, are based in their foundation in irrational emotions and feelings, not in reasons or things we've thought out. They're essentially irrational, which could in turn lead you to a kind of expressivism about morals, which is just the thought that, or the idea that moral claims are not true or false, they are just expressions of feeling. So when I say murder is wrong, I'm just going, ugh, murder, that's disgusting. I think that's a mistake to go that route. I don't know if a lot of people do go that route. Some people, like I think Peter Singer, goes the route where he would say, okay, this really stresses why we should rely on moral reasoning to get us conclusions. Because so much of what we think morally is based on these irrational emotions, we should try and get away from that, because that's bad. Especially because some of those emotions have to do with things like a deference to authority, or trying to preserve notions of purity. And for people like Peter Singer, they would say that those sorts of things are irrelevant to morality. Morality should be concerned with the harm we do, or the well-being of sentient creatures, for example, and being fair and impartial. And those sorts of concerns like purity and authority are not relevant. And if those sorts of things are creeping into our moral judgments, then we need to be extra careful to keep them out. And we keep them out by rigorously sticking to moral theories, like in the case of Peter Singer, utilitarianism. And so when utilitarianism spits out these conclusions like, oh, you should give away all your money to poor kids in Africa, when people say, but that's really unintuitive because that doesn't seem like something that we should be required to do, Singer is like, I don't care about your intuitions. I don't care about your moral feelings, what you feel is right. This is what the theory says you should do. That's a little bit of a weird way to go with it, I think. Some other people would say, well, you're not being purely rational and reasoned when you go that route, because still your utilitarianism is based on fundamental emotional intuitions about fairness and partiality and harm. And at that basic level, there's nothing really to choose between those and authority and purity and other moral intuitions, right? You just have to, again, appeal to even more feelings and more intuitions to say that these intuitions are more important than these intuitions. So really, what you should do is adopt a more fair and balanced view. And I think Jonathan Haidt takes this view. That kind of is more like, what's a good way to describe it? It tries to be more fair, I guess, between the different intuitions, and saying that they're there. Don't necessarily poo-poo the ones that result in claims that you don't like intuitively. They're just based on different foundational basic intuitions. And I think, there's something there that, the mixed view is better. We shouldn't say that all morality is just intuition and therefore we should chuck it. Also, a notion of morality that we can build up purely on reason and argument is also unrealistic, and it's not psychologically possible nor accurate that that's how we function. And I guess you could plug in some description here about reflexive equilibrium, which is the idea that you start with some intuitions, you develop a theory to partially to explain, but then partially to extend them consistently to other edge cases. Those come up with some conclusions. Maybe some of them are too unintuitive, so you go back and you readjust the theory, and you constantly are testing theory against intuition back and forth until you reach an equilibrium point where you feel like you've got something that's mostly intuitive and also mostly consistent and clear and rational. Whether you can do that, I don't know. Yeah. Let me think about whether there's anything more I want to say about that. maybe not. Is anyone still here? We've been going for a long time. Hopefully we're kind of like reaching maybe the end here. Oh, it's morbid. Oh, child pornography. Okay, that's the bottom of the page. That means that we might be in the clear here. I do not support child pornography, and I ardently argue against all forms of adult sexual relationships / pedophilia. Again, if you put this on a shirt, people would have questions. During a long discussion I had arguing in favor of age of consent laws with Amos Yee. Oh, that name sounds familiar. Wasn't that dude like arrested or kicked off the internet or something like that? Anyway, there's a small section where he questioned whether child pornography could ever be used in a positive manner. I'd been made familiar with some research indicating it was possible that this could be the case. Bunch of research. So there would obviously be significant hurdles doing this in an ethical manner. It would be essential to ensure that no new pornography abusing minors would be created, and that anything being used as part of any therapy was obtained in an ethical manner. Obtained in an ethical manner. Well, how would you do that? Yeah, I mean, I guess if you just used existing pornography, you could say that nothing new is being, you're not creating. Are you contributing to a market demand for more content like that? It would be essential to ensure that no new pornography abusing minors would be created. Yeah, and you'd get it in an ethical manner. It's hard to imagine how this would even be possible. In entertaining this scenario, many who argue against me online are quick to claim that I advocate for ethical child pornography or some other reductive statement, though none of these claims are true. Yeah, but it seems like he's open to the possibility of there being ethical child pornography. I mean, I think a lot of this stuff I've seen some of this recently where there's like scaremongering on the right about what they call like the normalization of pedophilia, and other people who are concerned with what would you say, like a medicalization of pedophilia, where it's kind of like people have a certain condition, right? It's like an illness, a compulsion that they can't help, and this medical perspective, means that we should emphasize treatment, but this also involves a destigmatization where you need to create the atmosphere where people who have that compulsion can feel like they can come forward to get treatment and to get help. And then, the added implication is that this would be an effective harm reduction technique, because if you can have people with that compulsion come forward and they can get help or assistance, then there would be less actual child abuse, because on the assumption that a lot of people with these compulsions don't actually want to abuse children, although I imagine many find convoluted ways to justify it in their head. Yeah, and that the upshot is not necessarily even, well, I mean, maybe the part of it is compassion, that there are people who genuinely suffer from that compulsion. They have certain desires, and it conflicts with certain moral feelings that they have, and also that you just want to reduce the abuse of children. And then on the other side, there's a worry that once that bringing it into the open, destigmatization goes some way to somehow like condoning child abuse. Which I understand that worry, but I think you can, and the reasons to attempt to thread that needle are important. And I think we have a lot of analogs in history, right? So if you think of cases, for example, where the way PTSD was treated prior to and during World War I, where it was seen as a moral failing, right? Men who broke down and couldn't enter function or enter combat were seen as cowards. Many of them were just executed or subjected to firing squads, because it was seen as like a personal moral failing that they were accountable for and should be punished for. Eventually, there was a turn towards medicalizing the condition of what was shell shock, what they came to call shell shock, and which we now know is PTSD, or like really severe PTSD. And through the medicalization, it was like, no, these people, there's something wrong in their nervous system and their brains, and they need treatment for it. And part of that is extending some amount of compassion and care to them, on both sides, right? The medical interpretation could come from compassion and care, and it also results in compassion and care. Almost certainly has better outcomes, right? You're not just executing people for things that they're beyond their control. And even getting people functioning again, right? So they can actually live their lives, not suffer. So it's better all around. But the thing is, it's important to recognize there that you're not then saying, oh, PTSD is a good thing. Yay, PTSD, you're just neurodivergent. So we want to celebrate your difference or something like that. It's like, no, PTSD is still bad. We still want to get rid of it. We don't want any of it. We don't want it. We want to get rid of the causes of it. We want to get rid of its instances, all of it. We don't like it. Right. And I think that's what people, need to recognize in the medicalization approach, right? Is that the destigmatization and the compassion and the care doesn't come with saying that the thing you're talking about is good or okay or should be accepted or anything like that. You can still reject all of that stuff. Yeah. Okay. I think that's right about where I want to end.